I feel like it's every American has the potential to be a talk show host. I think it's just like in their DNA. Cool. I feel like it's every American has the potential to be a talk show host. I think it's just like in their DNA. I can hear you. I don't know. I don't know if people can hear me. I should also.
There we go. Okay, so can someone just two people like people in the chat and YouTube just say if they can hear me and Matt?
1, 2 test.
Okay. Man. Okay, they can hear us now, apparently. I hope so, anyway. I was meant to grab your book, but it's up there now.
I've got it. It's probably going to be reversed.
I sort of want to prove to you that I actually have it. I feel like I could just, yeah. It's up there. No, I do. We're going to be discussing. I'm joined by Matt Colquhoun, as you will know, Xenogothic, now going under his real name, as am I, to a degree. We're going to be discussing his book, Egress, which is... Okay, they can hear both of us. Cool. We're going to be discussing Egress, which is a book which, once again, covers Mark Fisher, covers voice and exit. It dips into the Nick Land CCRU influences. It dips into a lot of stuff, mental health and capitalism. We're going to be discussing all of these things. So, Matt, thanks for coming on to the first ever Hermitix live stream with someone else.
Absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure to chat to you.
Which is going well. It's going just as I imagined it. So yeah, man. Basically, the basic question: what's this book about, and how did it come about, and when was it published, and how has your opinion of it changed since you've published it?
Yeah, I guess. Well, yeah. Just perfect luck, really, is that this book came out in March 2020. The book launch for Egress was the last thing I did before lockdown happened. And yeah, thinking about a book after it's come out in those circumstances is probably, I couldn't imagine anything worse now in hindsight. It was awful. But what's the book about? The book was initially my master's dissertation. So it was written primarily in 2017 in the aftermath of Mark Fisher's death. I was a student at Goldsmiths, University of London at that time, on the master's degree in contemporary art theory, which Mark taught on with a few other people. And so there's kind of a clearly quite fraught gestation period for it. But I guess the point was that it was never really intended to be a book. It wasn't even really intended to be a master's dissertation. I basically just showed up in London, sort of only somewhat philosophically curious. I'd been working in the arts for a few years as a photographer and like a technician, basically installing exhibitions. But I knew I wanted to write and I wanted to get better at it. And I really loved Mark's work and the work of Kojo Eshin, who's also teaching alongside Mark. They shared an office together at Goldsmiths. So it's basically my dream to just go and learn from them both. So I kind of showed up to Goldsmiths half with my career in mind, and half just sort of wanting to indulge and learn a bit of philosophy for the first time. And despite how appearances, the book is not really a continuation of either of those things. Mark was doing a course about post-capitalism, which I didn't get. And Kojo was doing a course about Reza Negrestani's Psychonopedia, which I ended up sort of just being this really fascinating crash course into this just weird other world. But when Mark died in January 2017, it just completely turned everything upside down. University wasn't really important anymore, sort of invested in this 1-year master's course and just didn't really, everything just collapsed. And there was quite a large, for the first 2 months after Mark's death, I was just seriously considering just dropping out, and I don't know what I would have done instead, but I guess I just decided to push through and if I had to write something, I wanted to write about what had happened. I wanted to take what I sort of learned in the first semester and just write an essay about what we were sort of going through as a community. And I think that's all I've done sort of since. I think that started as, Gothic blog as a way of sort of continuing that, and just sort of dealing with the sort of grief of it, and sort of just that trauma. So it's not. It doesn't really. It kind of makes out the book's definitely not a beach read, but it was just a way of trying to do philosophy about something that felt important, which at least to us, which I guess maybe that sounds a bit glib, but it really, I guess it's maybe the stuff we'll come on to, but it was a sort of moment where everything that we'd been learning just didn't feel important anymore, and I guess it was an attempt to try and claw that back, and somehow that process just was pushed through and became a book. I'm not really sure how that happened actually in hindsight.
Has it been pretty successful as books go?
I don't know. I think it's weird that I think Repeat knew immediately that it was anything that has Mark's name on it is going to sell. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't really the point. It was always sort of more like, the whole reason for putting it out with Repeater in a way is that, I had this thing that I felt quite proud of, but I didn't really want it to be seen as like a Mark Fisher cash-in. I sort of wanted to be like, well, because Mark helped set up Repeater with Tarek Goddard, and I thought, well, if Tariq likes it and if Tariq thinks it's worth publishing, then publish it. And if he doesn't think it gets that sort of sign of approval, then it's probably not worth doing. It's probably not my place to do it. So there was a lot of that anxiety kind of going into it. But once Tariq sort of thought that I'd done Mark justice, and kind of he sort of was saying, at least it does interesting things with maybe his work or I don't know, whatever else. As far as he was concerned, it was something that they wanted to do. So I was really happy to do that. I guess as I don't know if what measure of success comes from that. I feel like it's the sort of thing that won't really be apparent for a few years. Really, it's because I think so much about Mark's work and his legacy is still so fraught, and I think broadly misunderstood in a lot of ways. I still think there's some things in the book that if I could go back, I'd probably have changed my mind upon. But for me, it was just a portrait of that moment that I felt was sort of important to grasp. It's very much a product of its time, and it probably will age. But that's fine by me, really. I feel like it was a really significant moment for me, and I think for a lot of people. I just wanted to kind of get that out.
Yeah, man. I've interviewed recently Grafton Tanner. He recently wrote about his book, The Hours Have Lost Their Clock, about nostalgia and the politics of nostalgia. And he said at the start we were talking about Mark Fisher, and he said, yeah, I'm fairly nostalgic for Mark Fisher. And I was like, realized in that moment, I basically always think of Fisher's work as now and not gone. But it's been years. It's been years since capitalist realism came out. So it's a strange. It was a weird book to read in that sense of like admitting to a past in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, there was. I remember there was a review of the book that was sort of like that in a way. I think because a lot of the reviews kind of stick in your head as you go through, but there was one that was sort of saying that as much as it's a book about melancholy and about mourning and actually trying to kind of overcome those things, I guess personally and politically. I think someone said that it inevitably ended up being quite a mournful book, and I was like, well. Yeah, it's kind of hard not to be. It's kind of and that's kind of what I find interesting about it in a way, and that's kind of what's I think the whole point of writing it is that I think Mark's work was so much not about. It wasn't a kind of transcendental book like we have this kind of like before and after capitalism sort of thing, but then there was just this tension suddenly that how do we read Mark Fisher's work in this time of like a before and after Mark time. And that's kind of what I find most interesting about Mark's work. There is this tension in it where it's like there's this sort of transcendental critique, and then there's also a very immanent critique. And I think once Mark died, I think there's sort of the paradoxes and contradictions of holding those two sorts of methods like really came together. But I mean, Grafton's book's amazing too. I had the absolute privilege of reading that, proofreading it actually for Peter a few months ago, and it might be, I think, the best book about nostalgia that I've I think, and maybe this kind of fits into what you were saying really, because I think I remember saying to Grafton that it's like I think I've never thought I'd read a book about nostalgia that felt so contemporary.
Yeah.
But I guess that's kind of what's so weird about a lot of Mark's work, actually, at its best. That as much as he's dealing with a lot of those like affects, and he's dealing with the past and haunting all these things, it's always, at its best, it always felt totally like, and it still does. I think it's still at its best, it still feels really contemporary. Which is, I guess that's kind of the weirdness. That's the kind of complexity of where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, that fits right in because, there's the cornerstone perhaps of his thought, especially in terms of time, is the fact that, well, we seem to be moving but not moving. So that work will sort of always fit as a sort of a functional philosophy until time decides to do something, or capitalism decides to do something. But until that point, we are still stuck in this, slow disintegration of the future, which is now just living in a present, which Grafton Tanner, talks about, just this like reiteration of false, fake, weird nostalgia, which, I'm nostalgic for the 80s. I wasn't even born then. I don't care about the 80s. What has media done to me? I don't even, I only like Salisbury Hill by Peter Gabriel. I don't like the rest of the stuff.
That's it. That's what it comes. That's what it boils down. Everything boils down to Peter Gabriel. I feel like he's a measure for time itself.
I was watching the music video for like of him live through the ages, and it's like peak boomer. It's honest. It really is. It's like watching this boomer like grow, which is a strange thing to say, but yeah. I mean, so maybe let's just like keep it within the book, because I feel like we'll go off the rails later when we get to capitalism. But let's just sort of explain the title now. Like, the first word, egress. What's egress?
I guess, what is egress? I guess that's part of the. It's a word that Mark uses basically in The Weird and the Eerie. But he used it once. But it was a really intriguing word for us when we were at Goldsmiths in 2017 after Mark died. We sort of developed this little research group because a lot of us started going through. They started clearing out Mark's office basically that he shared with Kojo, and a bunch of us were really close with Kojo. And as Kojo was sort of going through and boxing up a lot of Mark's sort of effects and papers for his family, he found all of these magazines and all these essays that actually weren't available anywhere else. So it kind of became this sort of like, there was this sort of grieving process of like sorting out Mark's things in his office. And then when we found something that wasn't really available anywhere else, we'd scan it and we put it online. I think the website's still live. It's egressac.wordpress.com. The AC standing for acid communism, obviously. But I guess I don't really know why we gravitated towards it. It's just sort of this word that we adopted. And then under that guise, we kind of organized a bunch of lectures together, and we put together this like small reader of some of Mark's lesser known stuff. But I guess for me, it went a bit further than that, because when I was sort of thinking about the moment that we were in, I guess, I was trying to think about why we gravitate towards so much. What were we trying to egress from? I guess to give the word a definition, funnily enough, I'm kind of more familiar with it now. When the book first came out, and I was trying to sort of just manage a lot of the publishing stuff, and would quite narcissistically Google egress or put egress into Twitter, I always got all these military accounts that were talking about egressing from things. So I guess I'm now fairly aware that it's sort of a strategic term in sort of military terms. But when I was first thinking about it, it just felt quite Lovecraftian, and it kind of fits with the context Mark uses it in Weird the Eerie, where I think an egress is sort of used to denote when a planet sort of emerges from behind another one after an eclipse. So the moon sort of egresses the sun in a solar eclipse, I guess, or lunar eclipse. A solar eclipse. And No, I don't even know. I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm just not an astronomer. Anyway, and it was also quite what's the word? Like nautical. So to egress was like, I guess when a submarine submerges was also kind of called an egress. So I kind of liked that sort of syzygy between the cosmos and the deep sea. But then I guess maybe the strategic sort of exit actually makes more sense too, because it was that kind of, in my mind, sort of started to bring Marx's work into conversation with like the situationists, for example. But I guess that what was interesting about it was that there were a lot of unanswered questions. There's this tension between, I guess it fits in with that haunting stuff, the nostalgia thing. This sense that Marx talking about at some point like an escape from capitalism, an escape from melancholy, an escape from whatever else, but at the same time, like, that's the sort of hauntological mode. But in a sort of more accelerationist mode, it's not. It's that there is no exit, there is no outside. The inside is the folding of the outside. It's this kind of immanent critique of capitalism, where egress kind of actually starts to feel quite redundant as a sort of term. Like, there's nothing to egress from. So what are we talking about? And I guess that's partly, sort of further what kind of was really intrigued me about it for using it as a book title. Really, it is so ambiguous, but I guess I think a lot of Marx's work seems still quite ambiguous to, well, I was going to say to a lot of people, I think to me as well. And I guess it just kind of captures that tension for me of exit and also exit from what, neither of which is particularly clear. But I guess that's where there's space for sort of generative thinking.
Yeah, I get the impression that maybe you retweeted this about this chat and you said that you're excited for it because your thoughts on some of the things have changed. I'm assuming one of those things is exit.
Well, I guess it's kind of this tension. I think I'd never really considered that. It's this understanding of this, like, an immanent critique, I suppose. It's this dichotomy between immanence and transcendence. The importance of that to a lot of like to Marx thinking, but also to, well, I mean, I guess this is partly a lot of what I'm trying to write about now in terms of like the early accelerationist blogosphere. This is kind of their key point in a way. You talk about transcendence and immanence, you kind of get into, I mean, it's relevant to Marx thinking. I think for most people that'll bring to mind a lot of thinking around Nick Land's work. But I guess what I find quite interesting more so now is how that was actually so, that tension is sort of synonymous with a lot of speculative realism, or what was then called like post-continental philosophy. So you're talking about Gilles Deleuze, Alain Badiou, Francois Laruelle, Michel Henry, the sort of four thinkers of immanence that became really important for that sort of like early 20th century philosophy. And I guess what was really striking, I think, for Mark and a lot of the other people is that as much as they were moving on from Nick Land and they were moving on from that CCRU influence, and they were moving into this kind of speculative realism side of things, looking at the kind of the sort of the Ray Brassier. Well, I guess you have for those four philosophers of immanence, you have the four speculative realists. You've got Graham Harman, Ray Brassier, Ian Hamilton Grant, and Quentin Meillassoux, who are kind of this, that they're kind of ushering in this next phase, what everyone in the blogosphere was talking about after the CCRU ended. And then Mark Fisher comes along and he sort of realizes, well, actually, hang on, we're getting really deep into this, but and we're sort of strings is kind of moving on from something, but then don't we have to also recognize that Nick Land's a speculative realist? And I think it's that kind of acknowledgement that throws a real spanner in the works for a lot of people in terms of how what they can carry with them, what they are carrying with them in terms of their thinking and what they're trying to leave behind. And I think that this point about immanence, which I think I'd initially overlooked in a lot of Egress, that I kind of would, because I guess so much of what I'm talking about is that kind of hauntological mode, that mournful mode, which is about transcending your own experience in a way, getting out of something. It's, I guess, that the side that doesn't get quite as much attention, which I want to give more attention to in the next book, is the fact that the lineage of this thinking about immanence that's got a very potted history, but I guess what's so potted about it is that the political responses to that thinking are wildly divergent.
Okay. Where do you stand on exit from capitalism now? Do you think it's a possibility in any sense?
I mean, what did I say? I kind of wrote some notes about this and what I was trying to say. Because I guess the thing, I mean, I think this is partly what I wanted to kind of interrogate in Egress too, is I do think it's important. It's one of those things that like I wish I could go back and ask Mark about now. It's like why does he use the word egress? And I think he uses it. Well, my assumption is that he uses this kind of more obtuse, old-fashioned, unfamiliar word because he doesn't want to say exit. Because exit is associated with land, what he's trying to move on from, essentially. I think Fisher he never stopped acknowledging land's influence, and he was still teaching land in his final course. He was teaching at the time of his death. He was going to do electron accelerationism. Him and his students were going to read the essay Machinic Desire, that's in Fang Noumena. So he was always using him, and I think even in the introduction in the other lockdown book, Mike, in the post-capitalist society lectures, there's a really interesting that I think would probably not go down very well now. No one's actually there's a it's interesting anyway. That's to pick up how people have addressed Marx's adherence to accelerationism in that book's been really interesting for me, but that's besides the point now. But at the start, when Marx introducing land, he sort of says he doesn't think you can call his position a kind of right-wing accelerationism. He says it's pro-capitalist accelerationism, which I think for a lot of people that's probably splitting hairs, and no one really probably would care to demarcate it that, especially in the left. People don't really give a shit about splitting hairs that finely. But I think it's interesting that Mark did, and I think it's kind of anyway. I think that's kind of partly. I think that's partly what's interesting about that's where my thinking's changed in a way. I think that I don't think that Mark believed in exit from capitalism, but then I don't think Land did. I don't think. I mean, that's kind of the point carried forwards, right? I feel like it's not when we talk about. I guess that when it's about a voice and exit, the point is this sort of it becomes sort of this patchwork thing, right? This kind of neo-cameralism of if you can't vote with your voice, you vote with your feet. You just leave wherever in this kind of new thing. And that's, I don't see, it's these days I don't really see how that fits into where we are as kind of an exit from cap. If that's ever becomes some sort of possibility or becomes like a sort of political reality for anybody, and that's a choice that's capable of being made, it will still be, it won't just be a break from capitalism. That will be a global situation that emerges from capitalism. And I guess it's that, sorry.
I was going to say, I guess for Land as well, like every sort of instance of exit that he talks about is basically exit into a place on the earth which is somehow more capitalistic, right? So you're exiting to like Shanghai or Singapore or somewhere which is basically trying to be accelerationist, if that makes any sense. You're exiting out of forms of states which haven't caught up with the fact that capitalism is winning or is won. I guess for Land, that is.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's I think it's how that differs from, I don't know how that differs from Fisher. Maybe it doesn't so much. I guess, I had a quote that I found on the K-Punk blog that I kind of wanted to read out, that I think it's maybe quite a nice summary of Mark's view on exit. But maybe how that relates to your point is, I think Mark's point is about subjectivity. Like you have a certain exit from a kind of subjectivity, and maybe there's a way of saying that Land's version of that is quite literal. The fact to be the subject of a state. Maybe to change subjectivity, all you have to do is move country, which maybe there's some sort of in a very sort of basic way, there's probably some sort of truth to that you're changing the material conditions from nation to nation are very subtly different. I imagine massively different compared to sort of England to Shanghai, And I suppose that will change your thinking in a way that's on a sort of most sort of, I don't know, basic level that we can maybe, it's not as radical maybe as people would hope it would be, but I think that's a form of sort of subjective exit that we can talk about. I don't know how far we can talk about it, but anyway. But yeah, I was looking at this. I can't even remember where Mark said this, but it's interesting because his view of exit, and this is sort of something I've been researching the past sort of year and a bit, is that a lot of the acceleration, the original accelerationist stuff, they're not talking about land, they're talking about Alain Badiou. And when the sort of Badiou favor was at its height in around 2005, because Badiou's book Being an Event had just been translated to English then, even though I think it was like first published in French in the 80s. But Mark's talking about Badiou, and he says, what I find most valuable in Badiou is precisely the emphasis on anti-worldliness. But being worldly is, of course, not the same as being material. Worldliness entails accommodating oneself to a social phenomenology, a set of determinations about what is possible, which crucially have nothing to do with the constraints imposed by materiality. So I guess that's sort of saying, maybe that's partly what that social phenomenology is partly what you're talking about, right? That kind of shift from country to country, a sort of the way that maybe your social environment determines how you see the world, which I guess he's sort of saying is that's not necessarily the same as what's material. Materially, we all live under capitalism, and we all have a very sort of set way of that's kind of blanket. It's immanently, we live in a world. It's world capitalism. There's no sort of outside of it, but each maybe different nation has a certain response to those conditions. That's interesting. Anyway, he carries on that what's inspiring about Badiou's polemics is, in other words, their refusal of capitalist realism. And what appeals to me about Badiou is certainly not the system, which I guess he's referring to. Badiou's whole thing is that maths is ontology. So for markets, he says that which as a maths incompetent, I have little affinity for and limited interest in. But his delineation of a militant phenomenology, his demand that we maintain fidelity with that mode of subjectivity, which through struggle, through unplugging from the dull somnambulism of the social, has attained a higher pitch of existence. The problem for me is that this seems to amount to a descriptive itinerary, which might be encouraging but has limited political application. The political question is how these militant breakouts can be engineered and what they are like, but not what they are like once they've already happened. So, yeah, I think for Mark and a lot of the accelerationists, the problem is that they're so fixated on May 68 as like, rather than actually, there's not really much conversation about how it happened or how it got to a certain kind of fever pitch. It's sort of all melancholic, and it's like, well, it's always retrospective. There's never a question of how can we make it happen again. And I guess it's when Mark talks about exit, maybe it's that kind of subjective exit that he's talking about. It's an exit from a state of mind, if not a which can still exist under capitalism. I guess that's where there's these. I guess that's these tensions between immanence and transcendence, that you can kind of transcend a state of mind that is still immanently possible, and even to an extent complicit within capitalism. Because capitalism is, I guess, like Land's whole thing is like capitalism is philosophy, and for Deleuze, philosophy is nothing but a pluralism. So I guess what maybe inspires Fisher, or maybe through Badiou, is kind of affirming that pluralism, that you can explore very different and disparate political positions and political realities within within capitalism, and nonetheless extend or go beyond capitalism's sort of determined framing, which I think is something that we witness all the time. People can readily challenge capitalist ideology whilst being under capitalism.
Yeah, I think that can be done in really interesting ways, though. I remember interviewing Todd McGowan when he spoke about how someone rear-ended his car, and it was sort of like he couldn't drive it off. So this is the way he told the story to me, but he just sort of wasn't fussed about it. He'd been thinking about getting rid of his car anyway, and he just made it out like as if he just walked off, right? Like, you know what? Like, and that's a huge mental shift, like a huge subjective shift to just move away from that, not specifically cars, but the sort of the capitalist assumptions which are happening like constantly on really small levels with regards to like productivity, what we're now on about with like hustle culture and grind set are really great examples of like, oh man, why do I feel compelled to do this? And the idea of Todd McGowan just being like getting out of his car and just saying to the person like, yeah, I just don't care. Like, you know what? I've leapt. I no longer want anything to do with that. But it's nothing to do with the material car. It's to do with like a shift, as you say, in the social reality of yourself. But the problem with that is, as someone who like does a lot of these things where, and I imagine you do too, you do become an outsider almost to yourself because you can't actually speak about your reality to someone, right? Like an example is like recently I was sleeping on the floor. You can't even say that anymore. It just sounds like a madman to most people, right? But like it helped my back and I sleep better and I get up earlier. So sleeping on the, but if you say to someone like, yeah, I just don't sleep on it. But then there's the question. I know this is a ridiculous example, really stretching your metaphor here of social, like phenomenology. But if you ask someone under capitalism, why do you have a bed? They don't really have a formulation to that question, right? There's a whole. I would say that tiny thing is like a pin which you could pull out of their whole structure of like your whole life is based on a ton of assumptions which are really based on these sort of the social functions of what it is to be a functional capitalist civilian, right? A bootlicker. I don't know
Yeah.
if you agree, but it seems like a few ridiculous examples. But
No, totally. I mean, my part of my day job at the moment is I do a lot of proofreading, a lot of corporate proofreading, essentially. And I was doing something for um, a government which I won't name, but it was just like a sort of generic. It was like a health and safety e-learning thing that someone just you click through when you start a new job, and it was
yeah.
all about mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just all about sort of like things you can do to just about mental and physical well-being. Like, say the example is something like, you have to say you've got to go for work, you have to go on a really long drive. What are the things that you need to do and plan in advance that make sure that doesn't impact your mental and physical health? Because like going on a really long drive can be knackering and it can be stressful, and it's just like, and it feels like at a really generic level, it feels like sort of, I mean, on the one hand, it's common sense stuff. Like I feel like partly in the workplace, it's not common sense. Just kind of partly why it needs to be said. You kind of you make it acceptable to have these concerns, and you want to maintain your mental health well-being. But as I kind of go through it, it becomes more and more obvious that the concern here is, I mean, it's sort of a Foucauldian point. The concern here is not about. It's not like it's in any sort of innate altruism. It's just about how can you maintain you as a worker. And that's all. That's the bottom line. And it's interesting doing a lot of this corporate sort of. I don't even know what you call these things really, which is probably bad because it's my job to read them. But it becomes so blatant how they're very. It's precisely as you say. Basically, I'm kind of just trying to. It's another way of saying your same point. The question, the point about a bed is good. I guess it's like, it's a way of like It sounds really superficial, but you sort of like, it's like this sort of document would say you have a bed so you can get a good night's sleep for the sake of your job. It's like for the sake of your job is kind of like the unspoken like caveat at the end of every reason for doing anything. And I guess it's just like, what if it wasn't? Like I think that's as basic as it is. It's just, what if it wasn't?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like the Foucauldian thing, I remember having a weird moment like this when I worked in retail. I won't sort of name where I worked because they're all basically the same, so it doesn't really matter. They're all just abattoirs for the soul, whatever happens. But I remember being in. I had to go to like yearly meetings, like pump up the workers, get them involved. But it's like I'm getting paid the same, right? If you don't pay me, I'm not going to be here. They didn't seem to understand that. But at the end, we had to rate like our feedback for the company, like rate it out of 10, how much we liked the job, and we had to give like reasons why we worked there, which was an insane sort of almost psychological a psyop, especially in a job that you don't want to do. Like, which is most people's jobs, I would imagine. I'd say that more people, like the higher percentage of their jobs is that they just need to live, right? They don't really want to do that work. So then to say to someone like, why do you work here, is that implicit understanding of like, none of us want to admit that we all know the invisible reality of we need money. And like, no, we don't. I don't want to die. I need to eat. But we also know we're not allowed to admit that. So like, I gave it a 7 out of 10 and said like, this retail store sold good vegetables, which is like, what does that even mean? And when I got back, I had to go in a meeting for being negative for a 7 out of 10. And I thought, well,
Wow.
that's above a 5. Like, that's positive. But they said like, what, they all the usual questions like, what can we do and stuff. But then you're just stuck in this dilemma of like, there's no unless you want to completely restructure society for me, then there's nothing you can do. Right? It's just like
Yeah.
we're stuck in a complete like Foucauldian bind, as you say. But equally, you, like we've said before, you constantly have to eat the crap of capitalism, because it does not accept it when you're like that person. They just see it as whinging, I guess.
Mm. I think that kind of gets to it though. I guess it's like the extremism of that like binary. Like yeah, like is it between just sucking up and getting on with it, or yeah, or completely redesign the whole system. But it reminds me that I feel like this on this. Okay, I'm kind of aware that saying this point about immanence and transcendence probably just goes a bit over heads, because I mean it is kind of pointlessly complicated. But it reminds me there's a really great essay by Benjamin Singleton in this. Like, I think it's a issue of Eflux that was about accelerationism in like 2009 maybe. It's called Maximum Jailbreak. I think it was quite a popular essay for a while, but it's kind of maybe fallen out of thinking. But I kind of feel like it's the perfect example for a lot of it kind of represents the levels in that kind of thinking. So when he talks about, the reason he uses the word jailbreak quite explicitly is that it's jailbreak something like it's quite a specific activity. It's not just escape from a system. It's not escapism, I guess is his point. We get very stuck in this belief that the problem when we have these methodologies of exit or egress or whatever is that they just become escapist as these kind of fantasy ideas of transcendence. But Benjamin's point is that jailbreak is very specific. It's a requirement that you deploy sort of strategic thinking regarding like design, like literally what would you do to plan a jailbreak? What do you have to do? Like you have to gather certain materials, you have to get the blueprint of this thing. And it's not like I don't think you can't really frame escaping a prison as well as like escaping society. I guess it's like you've kind of been removed from actually the possibilities that lie within society as a whole. And I feel like that's a more interesting way of framing what capitalism is like in a way. It's like it is kind of like a prison. And there are far more opportunities of how we can do things beyond its walls. And to get there and to actually enjoy, you're not leaving society. It's not escape. You're not going into space. You're just literally like escaping Alcatraz. And they say no one's ever done it, right? But I guess, it takes a kind of level of strategic, even design thinking to kind of make that happen. And I think that's kind of how I nowadays understand the sort of left accelerationist vibe. We kind of see a return with it. Like I've been reading Benjamin Bratton's new book, The Revenge of the Real, on what is it called? Politics for a Post-Pandemic World, which feels like left accelerationism by another name. It's just sort of asking, well, if we can't escape, but how do we organize a jailbreak from these sort of conditions, this kind of mindset, using what we've got at our disposal? Because a lot of these sort of areas of knowledge that we have, the problem isn't that there's no knowledge of an outside. It's that knowledge is kind of entrapped within a certain kind of thinking. You could use your engineering know-how rather than building a bank. You could, I don't know, build someone else, build to the world. But I guess the point is that it's an attempt to be far more strategic about it than just imagine you can just smash everything and then what? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting thing in that prison analogy, because I mean, I mean, I know I like to dunk on people who are sort of like just stuck, but the problem with escaping from a prison, and I'm ripping this completely from Gurdjieff, but it works here. The problem with escaping a prison is that you need to know you're in a prison first, right? So this is
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
if you're, and that's a horrible fact, is especially if you're like in a ward of a prison where no one else knows. So every discussion you have with them is always at a complete remove of like what the actual reality you're in is, and all you're thinking is like, is there anyone else in this prison who even like acknowledges it? But that's a real difficulty thing. I mean, that brings us to like the idea of the outsider in capitalism and just feeling like completely, I mean, I guess an example of this, which is like has been of recent years, which like I jokingly brought up at the start, but like the idea of grind set, ironically, and the idea of hustle culture, and the way that's propagated into this like behemoth of like weirdly parasitic Silicon Valley culture, which seems to be infecting every facet of every hobby imaginable. Like every hobby has become this like hyper minimal, hyper productive, monetized thing, and no one seems to be enjoying themselves at all. And that seems to be the way of some possibility of exit is to sincerely just be like, I just want to do this. Like, can you leave me alone, sort of thing.
yeah. Um, I think you're kind of totally right in that sense of I had something on my mind and then I got caught up thinking about grind hustles and I've sort of forgotten what I was grind set. I was thinking what brought to mind. I guess it's that this. I suppose it is. Well, yeah, it's a question of ideology essentially. I feel like that's kind of it is what it comes down to, right? Like, what would you say what did you say before that?
The prison, and you need to know you're in a prison.
Right, exactly. Yes, sorry. Yeah, so that which reminds me of like that's the argument for Plato's cave, right? I think that's what when I'm sort of reading that quote out from Mark where he's talking about Badiou and this idea of a militant phenomenology. I feel like for Badiou, I mean, and I guess it's to say that there's lots of problems with Badiou that this kind of sort of a lot of the blogosphere had, but it's interesting because that's he takes that to be that's what Plato's arguing with Plato's cave, that you need to understand that these projections are projections, and I think for Badiou makes the point that like if you realize that if you however this happens, you understand the nature of the world that you're in, you understand that these desires, these projections, these things that you're kind of that are dancing in front of you are a projection from another, that this is a construction and there's a world behind, there's kind of a wizard behind the curtain. I guess that the often point that's made for Plato's cave is that you can escape the cave. There's an outside that you can get to. But Badiou's point is that what's always missed from that is the return to the cave. It's not just that you leave and then you frolic about in the fields in the sunshine. What he calls what politics for him is education, which is that if you're somehow able to unshackle yourself, you go back down and you try to convince others that they are also wearing shackles. And that there's kind of a social responsibility there, that it's not just about, if to realize that you're in, if you're in a prison. I mean, hopefully, you're not in a prison alone, but it just sort of the fact that there is work to be done, which I think kind of introduces a problem that's, I think that's maybe the precise moment where I think Fisher and Land especially differ. If they both have this view of a kind of like a philosophy of immanence, or inspired by philosophies of immanence, Land's sort of political response is just do nothing. I feel like for this sort of the post-Landians of the accelerationist blogosphere, their point is that that's not good enough. There is especially I think for someone like Land, who was a teacher and was their teacher, like he's almost betraying what kind of initially inspired them in the first place, that there is a responsibility to educate. And to be a teacher is to be in that position of is to hold a militant phenomenology. and try and, if not convince people of it like a preacher, at least get them to awaken, have that moment for themselves, to give them the tools to organize their own jailbreak.
I mean, one thing I'd add in there, which is just ties into one of the questions that I had, is the way that, especially in this book, the way you write about capitalism in the way that Fisher formulated is that it comes across as this like Phil Dickey and Philip K. Dick, maybe Ballard, but early Twilight Zone reality, whereas the capitalist reality is almost as if you could go up to the wall of a, like, what was it, Morgan Stanley or a bank, and just like push it over. Like, we all know. So I want to adjust Plato's cave. I am better than Plato right now. But I think I think an adjustment needs to be made, especially after COVID, in that we need like a mirror or something where the projections are. So like we all occasionally like glance up or like actually get a look at the real or the doorway out, and we can just see it. And everyone's like looking at each other as well, especially in COVID, where it's like, yeah, by the way, like you can all just go home and remote work. And no one said like, hang on, we could have just done this. Everyone's commuting for hours and they're miserable, and this has made a fair amount of people like happier. Sure, fair enough. There's been positives and negatives, but the positives have been these things where, like, let's say the elite, the capitalists, whatever the elite, didn't want to acknowledge, like, yeah, this could have been done all along, and we all knew it could have done, and we all knew it was also quite fake. So there's this thing in the cave of like everyone acknowledging that at some point in their life they had an experience where they saw the real but no one wants to sort of like fully admit it because they don't really know what that's going to mean for the future. So it seems to be almost a pressure pot of like, is it just getting to the point where we go, you know what, I don't give a shit what's in that mirror reflection. I don't care how bad it is. I'm sick. Like, I know this isn't real. I'm sick of it. But the problem is that needs to be collective, right?
Yeah.
So there's the problem.
Yeah, there's like the what does it remind me of? There's like there's a line that Fisher has in The Weird and the Eerie where he's like, and I think it's something that I talk about in Egress too, which is that like the terrors are not all there is to the outside, and I guess it's part of this whole confusing thing that he has this talk. He's talking about transcendence, but he's also talking about how the insides are following the outside, and I don't know. There's a lot of complicated shit in there, but kind of implicitly, I wish he made more of it, but he doesn't. Anyway, I guess it's that the question for me becomes, if terrors aren't all there is to the outside, but I guess it's who's afraid of Virginia Woolf sort of thing. Like, and I guess it kind of comes back to we sort of touched on it before, this idea of nostalgia, this idea of the problem of the new, which I think is kind of particularly what a lot of the accelerations sort of pick up on, and that Bourdieu particularly talks about sort of around the financial crash, right? It's like which I guess is kind of what I find interesting about Bratton's book that I talked about earlier. He's talking about like, and a lot of people now talking about post-pandemic, whereas 10 years ago we're all talking about post-crash politics, and if this kind of catastrophic, well, not necessarily catastrophic, but this kind of like huge, epoch-defining, decade-defining at least event can somehow change where things are going. And the terror, I guess, for the more people is that it doesn't, which is kind of what happened with the crash, right? We just get austerity. We kind of get people doubling down on the politics of before that happened, which I think is partly maybe what might happen with the crash. But I guess anyway, the point is for me is that it's who's stopping that from happening. I feel like there's this one sense that there's this idea put on that kind of the Leotardian view, like we love our sausage rolls and we love our pubs and suburbia. We don't actually want some other new thing, and that's one way of looking at it. I wonder to what extent actually it's the other way around. It's like the way that the reason that capitalism more generally is stagnating is because there have been a lot of opportunities for the new to emerge, and it's capitalists that kind of stop it, because it's that though so much of capitalism and markets seems to be like speculating on what's going to be the new thing, what's going to be the new trend. They don't want to speculate on something that could actually change the way the system operates, which could be which could work for them or not. Like, I guess it's the kind of thing with like automation. Why don't we have a lot of these certain technological developments, things that could be far more normalized, like working from home? I guess the question is, they know it could be a thing, we know it could be a thing, but I think, I think the anxiety around betting on it for productivity is that they don't know which way it's going to go. And I feel like there's a kind of cowardice in it almost, not from people that want to work from home, but from bosses essentially, that just don't want to bet on something that they can't be totally sure is going to work in their favor, even if it's something that, I think this is kind of where a lot of the sort of humiliations that Land talks about comes in. The fact that, these things might not work in our favor, whether that's the bourgeoisie or if it's just like a kind of white Western mindset, that things are not working in the West's favor right now, that he seems to sort of quite glibly celebrate. I mean, that's kind of the gamble, and I feel like if there's anything that's sort of shared, there's a sort of gamble on a willingness to gamble on outcomes, because I guess you can never. It's partly a sort of the thing that comes from a lot of the sort of crash stuff too, where I was kind of I wrote about this recently for an introduction to Mark's writings, which I think is like his exiting the Vampire Castle stuff. Which I guess is relevant since talking about exit, but I feel like his whole the thing that he just not very clearly defines as the Vampire Castle is this sort of not the cancel culture that sort of seems to be like attributed to it today, but this understanding that there were certain popular cultural figureheads like the Owen Joneses and Russell Brands of the world who were using a popular celebrity platform to advance anti-capitalist ideas. And a lot of them, the sort of commentariat of the 2000s just thought that was a contradiction and was like, no, if you can't, we should always mistrust anyone who advances like radical ideas through capitalist mainstream, because it's just complicity. And Fisher's whole point in Exiting the Vampire Castle is I think this is a direct quote, purism leads to fatalism. The fact to think that you can't, the fact that you think if we think it's better not to get our hands dirty than to get involved with the system and see if we can bend it in our favor. Like if you're waiting for a kind of pure non-capitalist politics to emerge from within capitalism, you're going to be waiting forever. The left's just going to totally stagnate and never move anywhere. So you have to kind of take the risk and the gamble that maybe like there's the Audre Lorde quote, which is that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which is kind of still sometimes used. The point of that essay was that she's a black lesbian at a conference about all kinds of things, and she was protesting the fact that she was being compartmentalized. Her difference was it was assumed that if you're a black lesbian, you can only speak to other black lesbians, and you have nothing else to say to a wider society. And she sort of just deconstructs that as being a kind of what she calls academic apartheid, or not academic, epistemic apartheid. And that she sort of says, the point is that we need to combine our knowledges. Our knowledge has to have a place where it can, affect a wider system. And you can look at that now and you can say, well, that's true, but the problem is that now that's kind of the norm. Every sort of radical political movement of the last sort of 30, 40 years has kind of been co-opted. Not all of them, but an interesting as well. It's interesting which ones have and which ones haven't. And I feel like the point is that in a lot of ways, I guess maybe I'm sort of slightly Marxist terms, but say that the tools of the proletariat today will be the master's tools tomorrow. And that's kind of the gamble, right? It's like, the tools that we have now to sort of express, articulate our unfreedom, to make other people aware that we live in a prison. What's to say that those kinds of mechanisms won't be used for the opposite reasons at a later date? There's nothing to say that won't happen, and in all likelihood, depending on what we've got, that might be the case. But it's better to try than just give into a kind of purism / fatalism. I'm realizing now I've ranted there for a while, but there was another point that I did have that I think is interesting on this, at least on the idea of the cave, where Slavoj Žižek has a kind of really interesting analogy for this, where he talks about, and it's interesting, it's even more so in hindsight, but he talks about the film 300 when that came out, Zack Snyder's film, and he talks about this whole thing where it's interesting the reception of that film going back, because like I think at the time he tried to frame it as like they were sort of criticized as being like this sort of like having these quite strong fascistic undertones, but he tried to do this whole him and Badiou not explicitly for 300, but Badiou has a thing in his book Logics of Worlds where he talks about Spartacus. As Spartacus is a kind of example of that educator. He's not what Spartacus represents to, he's a slave that becomes a soldier. And essentially what's interesting for Badiou is that there's arguably not a massive difference between those two things. You're still kind of subordinated to a cause. But what's important for the Roman slaves for Badiou is that what Spartacus represents for them is that they can immediately change their political position overnight. Like they can go from what's interesting about going from a slave to a soldier is precisely that there's arguably not much difference to it, and it's something that you can do immediately. So he kind of embraces this fact that what Spartacus represents is like the immediate transformation of a proletariat into a kind of into a militant, essentially. But Zizek kind of takes that too. He's like, well, I want to preserve the sort of radical undertones of Spartacus. So when they're going to have a film like 300, let's affirm that as kind of like he kind of tells it as not a parable of American imperialism, but leftist sacrifice and discipline. And everybody just says it's bullshit, but which is probably a fair point, because I guess that you look at how that film's been received now, and I think everyone. I remember there was a really good art review of it, or like a 10-year anniversary review in AV Club, and this guy there like writes about how it's basically like it's our Birth of a Nation. It's like the proto-Trump film of that era, which is quite interesting take, I think. But anyway, beyond that, Zizek makes this really interesting point that the film's really claustrophobic. It's a film kind of about political sacrifice and discipline, about a kind of revolutionary mindset, fighting off a kind of, an invading horde that outnumbers you. But what's really weird about it, and so indicative of the time, is that it's not filmed on the banks of the Aegean Sea. It's filmed in a fucking soundstage in Montreal. And it gives the film this really weird, like, the CGI kind of claustrophobia. And I feel like that's kind of interesting, is like, that's if we're in the sort of Plato's cave situation, like it's not a cave anymore. It's a Hollywood soundstage. And it's far more difficult to, that those projections on the walls can seemingly expand outwards to the horizon. But there's still this certain, I feel like maybe the point is that there must be this kind of, like sense that we have that if things are not as this, a kind of Matrix vibe, right? Like we know that something's not right, but it's kind of getting to that and untangling that kind of simulation or whatever is kind of like part of the issue. But it's kind of interesting how that there's a further point you can make that's kind of whether that's kind of a intentional thing. Because there's a great essay by Bertolt Brecht where he talks about the innate radicality of like theatre and cinema. He kind of like dismisses the novel as like a bourgeois pretension, because when you read a novel, like the modern novel has this like radical potential where you're reading something and it can kind of actually transport your own subjectivity. You can if it's in the first person, if it's written in the first person, you can transport yourself and imagine yourself as another person, and that's radical in itself. But the problem for that with Brecht is that it's all internal. It's kind of it's an idealized kind of transformation. What works about theatre for him in particular is that it's external. It's external drama that happens in front of you and beyond you. And therefore, like it far more readily encourages external and direct action. and it's kind of like, you know, it expands beyond your interiority into actual space, and that's what he said that cinema can do as well. And so there's kind of an interesting turn there where we get to this point where cinema is if it still has that potential, it's done by kind of affirming a new interiority. The kind of fallacy of 300 for Zizek is that if there is that kind of that sense of the external has been captured in a really weirdly paradoxical way. So and I guess that's Fisher's point, right? Not so much the inside as a folding of the outside. In terms of cinema now, it's the outside that's a folding of the inside. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, I'm thinking once again of something that me and Grafton Tanner actually spoke about, which is we spoke about like Marvel films, and he spoke about Marvel films for a while, about them being related to like the military-industrial complex, and then I mentioned Ready Player One, which I think is probably the best film ever made. To be fair, not ironically, I just think it is. It's if you want to understand the modern world, just watch Ready Player One. You know?
I really enjoyed it when I watched it. To be fair,
it's enjoyable in a like a sadomasochistic way. Like you're seeing the absolute pinnacle of everything we're really talking about. But yeah, me and Grafton sort of brought out this idea that there's like a video on YouTube that Grafton pointed out to me, that you can watch a video on YouTube where it's like an hour long or whatever, and it points out every single Easter egg in Ready Player One. So like the whole experience of watching this film is basically knowledge that you're in this caught in this weird like claustrophobic loop of, well, what exactly, right? It's like the knowledge that you're literally admitting that you're entering into like meta cinema, and it seems to be the same with capitalism, with like hustle culture. It's like admitting that you're in this thing where you have to do that. Not there's anything wrong with that by itself, but you're admitting that you're entering into some functionality which is pretty depressing in terms of what you want to do. You're acknowledging something is bad, but then somehow finding a way to like find fun with it, which is weird. But one thing I wanted to add in, just with you said about, it was quite a while back now, but I want to add it in before we go on further.
I went on for ages. Sorry.
It's fine. You said about, and this was sort of a big moment for me because I was knee deep in land at the time. I think it was when I was writing my book on land, about this idea of, well, not everything, like, it's like sort of land goes on for ages about like, yeah, the outside coming in and this Lovecraftian, horror of capitalism, and then someone just says like, yeah, but not everything in the outside's bad. Like, and I think that's sort of almost a showstopper, and it makes me think of John Michael Greer's novels, his Lovecraft novels, the Weird of Halley series, which is all about people encountering Lovecraft from the side of the Lovecraftian other. So they go to Innsmouth and they're just like chatting to the people there, and they're just walking alongside Nyarlathotep, etc. And this idea that, well, who is it here who's sort of projecting this strange demonic thingness onto this, instead of being like, yeah, well, can we go up to it and see if it's this squishy weird thing and see what we can actually do with it, instead of like, cowering, think of Critique of Transcendental Miserabilism, which does make sense from Land's point of view, which for those who don't know what that, we can talk about this actually, I think as well, is for those that don't know what the Critique of Transcendental Miserabilism is as a piece of writing, it's basically, I don't know if you'd agree with me, Matt, the absolute point where you can see clearest where Mark Fisher and Nick Land split on their understanding and their personal understanding of what capitalism is. And Nick's basically saying, if you can't, if this almost like demonic, Cthulhic, Lovecraftian entity which is coming in from the outside, which I've defined as capitalism, doesn't like amaze you in awe, then you're going to be miserable at everything. Which I don't really know. I still don't know what to do with that statement. Right? It's like, well, okay, but you've defined the outside in a certain way. It's literally all noumena. So, but yeah, I don't know what's, that's just a few thoughts to throw out there.
No, it's interesting because I think that's where I think, like the point is true that you can't define the outside, like, and not in a, and I guess that's like, it's not just the, I mean, if we're talking about noumena in the sense that you can maybe, have knowledge of what's there, but you can't know it in itself, or which I guess is like you can't cross that. To be fair, I haven't read that essay of Land's in a long time, so I may be slightly riffing off, and it may be kind of I may not be my idea of what his argument is there may be slightly off, but I kind of feel like the whole point for like Deleuze and Guattari, for example, in their sense of what they call the image of thought, right? There's the like if philosophy, well, I kind of the way that I find works for me anyway, and maybe as a kind of blanket way of thinking about how Land and Deleuze and Guattari overlap, is that whenever Deleuze and Guattari say philosophy, Land just says capitalism. So they talk about how like philosophy is, I mean, maybe guess like the canon of philosophy is like encapsulates a way of thinking. It's not all that can be thought, but it's kind of like a certain set of boundaries about what we think can be thought. It's kind of like an Overton window sort of thing, right? But maybe a bit bigger than a window. I don't know. Like it's a kind of it's a plane of immanence too, right? It's a kind of, I guess this thing is there's an immanence there, but this is kind of the parody of like, or maybe the paradox rather of that kind of. Like I guess you can call Land's thought. I think maybe someone has done this before, but it's a transcendental miserabilism, and not transcendental miserabilism. Sorry, transcendental materialism. Mm-hmm. Like the materialist idea that from Marx, arguably, that we are for Hegel, consciousness produces reality. For Marx, reality produces consciousness. So what we think is determined by our material conditions. And I guess Land's transcendental materialism is that that's true, but we can't know our material conditions in themselves. And for him, that's philosophy. Sorry, I'm doing it myself. That's capitalism. Mm-hmm. So you can't know capitalism in itself, but capitalism is what produces our desires and our knowledge or whatever. But I guess what's interesting about that is that though it's transcendental, that there is an outside, it's still immanent, because it's like the reason that we can't think it in itself is like it's nature. We are products of nature. We are kind of a fragment of nature, and it's kind of like trying to think the infinite in a way. It's like, it's not that, I guess that's probably the best way of putting it. It's like this, what seems like we can have a kind of infinite plane that seems to expand out in all directions, and I guess can speculatively, like we have a sort of image of thought that defines what we can know and think now, and we still know that there are unknown unknowns sort of thing. But I guess that what becomes confusing then is that even though we can acknowledge there's a certain like infinity to our world, we can still have this sense of, even if we can have the idea, we can accept the idea there's no outside, we can still have an idea of the inside, which is I guess it's that sense of interior. That's kind of where what is kind of not a transcendental philosophy or not a transcendental thinking, was an immanent kind of philosophy, can still have certain characteristics of transcendental method. I can't remember where I'm going to this now. I kind of got down a rabbit hole, but I feel like I feel like it's that kind of conundrum anyway. I think maybe you're right in terms of when you see where Land and Fisher split anyway, is that it's like what you do with that knowledge, how you respond to that situation is, the politics of that kind of realization, which I guess is that it's not just, I guess the point too is that it's not just Landian. I feel like it's especially in our sort of internet circles, everyone associates that position with Land. But what becomes so interesting about a lot of the other thinking, like Ray Brassier's PhD thesis that he wrote at Warwick at that time, I don't know if Land supervised it or not, but Brassier's thesis rather, is basically just like an overview of everybody who shares that idea at that time. And it's very, very, it's broad. It's like it brings in like American pragmatists and scientists and philosophers of science, philosophers of history, fucking everybody. And it's interesting that for me anyway, that like we kind of focus on Land's version of that, when really what's so, it kind of goes both ways, not in a way to sort of denounce Land, but also like, there's a sort of paradox where you can hold that viewpoint and kind of have to acknowledge that Land's part of that crowd, like he's one of this gang. And then it's kind of exploring this with other people that aren't as familiar with it who then go, well, that's Nick Land, and then Land kind of becomes the elephant in the room. Even, but it's like, well, it's a really crowded room. He is the elephant, but like this is kind of like this is also like his nihilism is kind of like Brassiosaurus. So it's a scientific nihilism. It's not. It's his political conclusions. I think I don't really agree with. I think maybe I should say that I probably flirted with them. I think now I just don't agree with them at all, especially the way that he's gone online in the past couple of years with sort of outsideness stuff. But I think it's still worth acknowledging that the foundation that he's kind of moving on from is kind of just the position of science that's from like the past few decades. The kind of like I think of it as like it's like the rebirth of tragedy, right? He takes a sort of Nietzschean position, like what Nietzsche says, that tragedy dies when philosophy as a science kind of emerges, and we don't need these grand ideas of myth and the gods anymore. But then the problem is that as science has progressed and we've gotten to this point, this kind of this default nihilistic view of science, that we're just a small species in the vast cosmos of the universe, that kind of cosmic horror vibe, that actually then myth comes back. We can acknowledge the kind of Lovecraftian horror and then actually find that is resonant with current scientific thinking, as if it's kind of a mythologizing of science. So you have the kind of rebirth of tragedy, and I feel like that's where like Land's on that trajectory. But the role that myth plays in that kind of development is kind of a very legitimate point of. I don't agree with where he takes it, but it's like it's how you actually. Again, I'm just rambling now. I don't even know what I guess I have a point that I'm making, but I'm actually very aware it's also probably far from what your question was in the first place. So maybe I'll just stop there. Well, it's been a long day.
Yeah, I understand. This was always a problem with Land's work, which I was always hesitant to deal with, especially when writing my book, because I just wanted to write that sort of about that experience when you first encounter all this stuff. And I went the Land direction, you went sort of more the Fisher direction, obviously. But that, it just consumes you for 2 years and you feel like you're in this strange labyrinth. So that was about that. But there was a point near the end, which is why I struggled, like, writing the end of the book, was I basically realized that Land sort of has this thing which I call the bleaker than thou mindset, right? Like, that he projects onto everything, which always in hindsight sort of just, it's a bit frustrating because you can't then just look at the thing in the least unbiased way possible. But it's like, not only is capitalism this outside function, but it's also like this super nihilistic cosmic horror. And it's like, well, and there was almost this like race to see who could make this the bleakest in relation to almost min-maxing scientific data to just keep pushing the human down to this absolute, like, yeah, you think we're insignificant now, well, look at this data. And it was that just constantly you're like, well, all right, well, like, surely you only need to make that point once, and if that's the case, then I don't like what's the point then? And it just seemed to keep coming. But I don't really have anywhere like to go with that. But that's the problem with the bleaker than thou philosophy, is there's nothing that can like get in there as a javelin, because that's immediately drawn into this like we're just it's a great Land essay and it's one of my favorites, but hell baked, right? We're all just hell baked and nothing can penetrate hell baking, because it's like we're just skin bags on a rock in space. Like, okay, well, like, what am I meant to? What I've still got to do stuff. I've still got to eat I've still got to make a sandwich for lunch. But you're telling me that and it's just a complete abstraction. But I know Lamb would say that I'm sort of humanizing his work there. Maybe we can keep talking about this, maybe, but because this is a live stream and we actually have a fair amount of viewers, like my own sort of estimation of what a fair amount is, 2. Thanks, Mum. I'll say to viewers, if you want to write a question in the chat, then write a question, and I might read it out. It depends what it is. But one thing I wanted to mention from your book, which is like sort of humorous, but I also wanted to just bring in, is that you mentioned The Walking Dead at some point, and I was like,
oh yeah,
I was like, Damn, someone else other than me has like continued watching The Walking Dead.
I mean,
I
I
can't
didn't.
remember how you. I can't remember how you use it. I can't remember how you use it, unfortunately. But I had to jot it down. I was like, no, I've got to put this in because I don't know. There's something in The Walking Dead as a series that from this has been this sort of really great qualitative TV and media at the start that has. It's almost the transformation of an ideology because by the end you're left with your usual like basically Coronation Street with zombies.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting because this is I think like my weird fascination with it is kind of like it's a dramatization of the land trajectory. Like it starts off and it's super morbid, and then you kind of watch as like my favorite thing about that show is how the zombies in it kind of they decay more and more each season. So you kind of get the threat gets more and more grotesque as it goes on, but it also still gets more and more normalized. Like as much as the more grotesque it gets, the less of a threat it gets. And it sort of feels like if there was a kind of it's an ideological thing. It sort of feels quite landy, and it's like this started out, and I was shitting myself, and I was like morbidly fascinated by this, and now it is. Now you are just the boomer with a death wish. Like it's that sort of similar thing. But I feel like, I mean, I must say I haven't watched it in years. I don't know about continuing to watch it because I think I gave up after like season 9 or 10. I think around the time I was writing the book.
Okay, there's only like 2 more.
Right, yeah. I mean, it was, I really powered through, and I think I just kind of got really fed up with it because I mean but it's, I mean, it's the sort of thing that's like. It says a lot of. I mean, I just love zombie media in general. It's like my favorite genre of anything. But I think because of the sort of weird push pull thing of like, maybe another example is like The Last of Us. Like when The Last of Us Part 2, when that came out like last year, and that was the sort of thing. It was like a 20-hour game, and I remember I just wanted to binge play it forever, but I also didn't want it to end. And even though I kind of had a lot, similar to The Walking Dead, I had like loads of problems with the writing. I kind of felt like a lot of like it kind of got major criticisms of the game. But as far as world building goes, like I just kind of wanted to spend a lot of time there. And I feel like it says a lot that you feel that way about something that's essentially about like the end of the world, like a post-apocalypse where you actually enjoy spending time. There's something about that like is kind of fucked up in a way that I really enjoy. Like it just it raises a lot of questions, and I think The Walking Dead was like that. I feel like I just love the world that they built with that. Like in the comics too, I feel like I just love the whole vibe a bit. But then, yeah, I just didn't care about spending time there anymore after a sort of certain point.
Someone apparently has theorized that this is to do with Dunbar's number, right? The amount of relationships you can sort of maintain within a local group, and actually Walking Dead sort of gets bad once they're like, and here's like 4 more communities. So I like that you've ruined the dynamic. But one thing, apparently the love of zombie media is a British thing. I didn't realize this till like a year ago. Someone told me it's a British thing because I could watch any zombie film ever and just enjoy it. But it's an idea that I find interesting as well. Is like, you know, originally you have the original Dawn of the Dead with really slow, rambling zombies, and then some stuff in the 90s. Then you go through to like the remake. Then you go through to 28 Days Later, and they start to get a bit more virile. And then like the peak was World War Z. You know, they're like piling up. But this is the problem with that threat. Is like they have to like change humanity in relation to the threat. But now zombie films, like the last good one I saw was Train to Busan was good, and also Cargo. They were both good, but for other reasons, not so much the threat, but how the threat was presented. But just generally, I think World War Z was this like problem for that form of like an other horror. Is what do we do? Like what do we do with this threat? And it's like maybe the accelerationism we need is to accelerate Land's work to the extent that it just becomes absurd, which I think it's close to. Right, Hellbaked is so close to that of like, oh come on, really?
Well, that's it. I feel like he's. I mean, the credit to him. I feel like he's kind of done it on his own, really. Like he's done that just on Twitter. I was trying to find there's a really good. I'm sure there's a really good Mark Fisher essay on K-Punk about this. Where he talks about zombies. But but I guess it's partly that whole, what is it like? No, I won't be able to remember it. But there's something about it as like I mean, it definitely feels like it's when you said it being a British thing, which makes total sense. Only in that like in that sort of keep calm, carry on post-war ideology that we've sort of got, where like with zombie movies, especially English ones, I feel like there's this weird. I mean, 20 days later comes to mind, so that's definitely not the case. Well, no, I mean, Shaun the Dead's probably like the best example, where you've got like that mindset is you don't know who it's referring to. Is it keep calm and carry on in response to zombies, or is keep calm and carry on precisely the zombie mindset? Where you're just sort of affectless drone, like it's that kind of tension that feels like quintessentially British to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's genuinely one of the more intelligent zombie movies. I'm thinking of like the scene where Sean's hungover and he literally walks past 3 or 4 zombies to get to the shop to buy the Diet Coke or whatever. And I remember thinking that's actually a really smart scene. But yeah, not sure where we're going to go with the Walking Dead line, other than it's just this weird anomaly. But if there's any questions for Matt on his book or about land or Fisher and stuff, please put them in the chat. But I mean, yeah.
I guess the other thing that I did have some notes on was that we were going to talk a bit about mental health and capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious to know what your thoughts were beyond that. I guess because I had a few things that I could say about it that was kind of relevant. I think it's relevant to the book, and well, it's obviously relevant to the book, but kind of about that sort of zombie mindset too, and sort of what we're talking about. But I mean, it depends if you want to go there.
Yeah, we can go there because I mean, I think I've sort of touched on it earlier in terms of that retail. I mean, I have some fairly what would be considered in continental circles like anti-psychiatric views on mental health, and I am one of the people who thinks that you can think your way out of it, and to a certain degree, there is a choice aspect there, but I have to tread carefully with that, as I understand. But I think the in terms of mental health and capitalism, it's to do with that implicit problem we saw again about enjoying something. You're in the cave is shit, it sucks, but you have to be there because it's the only way that you can get money to live, and living at a certain point is like just better, if the job really sucks. But also, like, as I said, everyone's seen out the cave, and actually it might look all right out there, but we still all admit it. So it's that whole thing, but you have to enjoy that. So it's that, basically what I'm trying to say is that one of the big problems is we all are acknowledging that millions of people are miserable, but we also expect them to not be miserable, and also expect them to not admit the real reasons they are doing the things which make them miserable. Which basically, in a mental health sense, that puts someone in a really horrible spot where they can't even know themselves because they constantly have to, like, it's a super Foucauldian moment, but it's like a self-policing self-panopticon, right? You're like keeping an eye on yourself, like in the capitalist state where everyone else is also keeping an eye on you, right? Like even the simple fact of like, morning, how are you? If you actually said like, yeah, man, this sucks. I am down today. That's like, no, man, we don't do that. We don't do that. It's like that might be a very British thing.
Yeah, it's definitely British, but I think also beyond that too. I think you're right. We're just extra bad at it.
Yeah, we never.
But no, it's true. I mean, I guess it's, yeah, I realized that when I sort of was skimming over the notes I had written, and we did sort of talk about this, I guess, when we were talking about the work stuff. But I guess it's that maybe what I kind of had to add was that, because I think it's partly what's so interesting about it for Fisher. Like, I think there's a really, there's one of his most famous passages, I think, from Capitalist Realism is where he talks about, it's not about, we talk so much about brain chemistry, and like we understand that, like, depression, for example, it's like you have low serotonin, but we don't explore why you have low serotonin. Like but it kind of becomes this whole, like, there's a chicken and the egg thing there. But I find it really interesting because it is like it's interesting because I wonder that's one thing that I wonder where it fits into a lot of like the Landian relationship, because I think that's the one thing that gets carried over by Fisher, especially, is that sort of transcendental miserable. Sorry, I keep saying that, transcendental materialism. Like the materialist view of mental health is that, I mean, sort of saying about treading lightly about whether saying that you can get yourself out of a sort of mental episode or whatever. I mean, I feel like it's controversial online, but it's essentially the standard view of, if you go and access mental health services, that's what you will be told. It's like that's what they aim for.
They won't give you
kind of
very good
controversial.
ways
It's
to do
always
it,
like, no, they wouldn't. That's for sure.
CBT.
But I guess that's it. Yeah, exactly. But I guess it's like I guess it's the tension comes when it's, well, yeah. There are better ways of doing it, but I mean, it gets really complicated. But I guess it's what I find it interesting. It's that sense of like, there are. Well, I mean, I wonder where that fits into it. Where you can, if we could acknowledge that capitalism, or I don't know, are the conditions, what Marx, I guess we call them material conditions of our labor, are causing mental illness. But there is a sense that we don't necessarily know the thing that's causing that mental illness. I was reading about it earlier, because I think every couple of months on Twitter, I think it's also a line something that Mark maybe helped to popularize. But this idea that like ADHD is just your brain on capitalism, which like I've heard a few people get cancelled for saying it, and I've read a few articles where people kind of talk about how it's not remotely helpful way of putting things, and maybe guess that's true. But there's this like tension in it where, I feel like it kind of gets to the heart of that whole like that immanence, transcendence kind of issue. Like, we can say that it's because it's as if to say that what pisses people off about saying that is that like ADHD didn't exist before capitalism, and there's this kind of suggestion that if we escape capitalism, no one will have ADHD anymore. But I think it's more likely true that people have always experienced certain kinds of cognitive difficulty that probably amount to what ADHD is, those kind of that constellation of symptoms. But then you kind of also have to ask the question of, well, what was it that actually, why did that symptomatology emerge and become formalized at the time that it did? What made us focus on those kinds of things? I mean, you can kind of say that with lots of different examples, and they're all sort of controversial, really. You can talk about it in terms of the trans debate, the argument that trans people have always existed long before capitalism. Well, I mean, no, it's not really an issue for capitalism, but trans people have existed. There's records going back centuries. But there is also something to be said for why is there this focus on that as a thing now? And like you have to sort of tread very lightly, but I feel like we have to be able to ask those questions, because that's what we can recognize. It's kind of like the gender accelerationism thing that I think Nick's Land wrote, where we can see that this is becoming more of a popular social concern, or social. I mean, I don't think it should be a concern or a debate, is my personal position, but why that has emerged at this time is still like a kind of it's a historical thing to talk about, right? Like that's kind of the Marxist point. I think Marx always says that the whole point of having a historical materialism is that like we have the abstract materialism of science. That's kind of the mental health point, right? You can say that my ADHD is caused by my brain chemistry, but that's an abstract materialism. It doesn't actually it excludes, as Marx would say, it excludes the historical process. So I guess it's like, well, how do you put these concerns in? If you put them insert them into the historical process, what does it tell us about what's changing in society, where the new is coming from, and how do we, just even embrace it, or even, if that's the why we're reticent about accepting certain things and not others? What are they a threat to? And is that threat really gonna, is this not this kind of next evolutionary step, if not just for us as humans, that's probably quite far-fetched, but at least society. And I feel like that's those are the interesting questions that we probably we get squeamish about asking, when surely they're precisely the moments where like politics and philosophy and political philosophy kind of like, it's what it's for. Mm-hmm. Like those are the things that we should sort of be like sticking our teeth into.
Speaking of the new coming in, someone has asked you specifically, could you maybe share some of your thoughts on how community formation might look after the pandemic?
Oh God.
Yeah, so if you could just formulate that right now.
No, I mean, I really, yeah, that's it. I wish I could. I guess it's that I'm quite pessimistic about it in a way. I was really optimistic about it before, a lot of like this stuff happened. But I mean, it's kind of personal circumstance too. Like I lost my job in the pandemic and had to move away, and I now live in a city in north of England where I don't know anyone. I mean, it's not. I have two friends, but you know that's kind of like it's hard to get excited about new social formation when like the social formations I had before this all happened have been completely decimated, and it's kind of sad. I get sad about that quite a lot. So but I mean, I don't know. I think it's kind of partly, I think, a question of longevity. I think there was certainly a point at the start of the pandemic where I was really excited about what could. I mean, I think it's probably something that everyone's experienced, right? Like, I don't know. You spend sort of a few months inside. You go out and you have your first conversation with someone, and then you forget how conversations work, and you just like nod at people and smile weirdly, and you forget social etiquette completely. That's sort of how I feel at this point. Like I feel like, and maybe that the positive swing is that maybe we have to completely relearn social formation, and that in doing that we can do something different. But I feel like that's kind of the point, right? If there's a way to, it kind of fits in maybe with what we've been talking about. If there's a way of doing that kind of ignores any sort of prescriptiveness, that isn't just like, let's use what we had previously and build again. Like, is there a way that we can truly start from scratch? Because it is a bit of a scorched earth vibe at the moment in terms of size. So social formation goes, at least I think for a lot of people. But yeah, I guess it's a question of how to do that when you're just totally like immediately exhausted by social interaction. I can't hang out with people face to face for too long because I just feel like immediately like knackered. But those are kind of the problems, I guess, that need to be dealt with.
I had that before the pandemic as well.
Yeah. I mean, also same, I guess, to be fair, but it's definitely exacerbated. But that's the thing is, there was a point where it felt like it was exacerbating the best of like what it meant to be like a social animal, and now I feel like there's something. Maybe it's different for everybody, I imagine, but for me at least, it's sort of now started to just exacerbate the worst of it, and now I don't really know how to function as a social animal anymore. Apart from over Zoom.
Yeah. I mean, I try not to comment on these things because, like, a friend of mine sent me. You know, you say about like you've gone up north and you've got like two friends. Like that's like the norm. My one of my two friends sent me a meme to say like, your life's boring when the pandemic changes. Like the pandemic didn't really change much for me in terms of going out, so I can't really comment on this whole social. I can't comment on socializing.
It's yeah. No, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Well, no, I guess the one thing that I would say about that is that the one thing it's made me realize is that even as terms of like social formation go, there's a real like, at least in the UK, there's a strong like it's just London brain drain or whatever they want to call it, like how everything, money, culture, everything is focused on London. I feel like the same is true for social possibility. I've never had more friends and felt more like there was like potential to actually do collective stuff when I lived in London. And as soon as I left London, that disappeared completely. And I think that there's pockets of it elsewhere. I feel like if I moved back home to my hometown of Hull, I'd be way more optimistic about doing things after the pandemic. But even then, it wouldn't be the same. There's not the same sort of commitment to it that there is in London. Partly that's negative because living in London is just shit, and everybody has to come together and sort of support each other more. Like it's by necessity rather than for fun. But you know, that's I think that one of the major things that's been talked about throughout this pandemic, especially in the UK, is that like finally addressing that kind of divide, and that if the pandemic will make like it's forced so many people out of London back to wherever to other places, that maybe that will strengthen that. And I can only hope so, because I feel like that's one thing that I miss the most. And if there's a way of making that kind of community happen elsewhere in West Yorkshire, for me at least, or I'm totally up for trying it. But it is the conditions are so different from capital city to the rest of the UK that it's just such an enormous disparity. It's hard to have much optimism for elsewhere, but that's just pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, from I've heard from outside of the UK that the UK is actually understood by a lot of people as basically just London. Like that's what they think of, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but we have another question which is to do with saying more about the land fisher split and how. So the first question is more about the land fisher split, and then the second question is how did land get from CCRU to Dark Enlightenment? That's like the lost era, I think. So like the CCRU loosely ends in about 2003, I think, with Hyperstition.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's like a lost chunk, and then land comes back. But even at the end of Hyperstition, there's clear hints towards more Xenosystems type stuff. So as for like what actually happened, I don't think we really know.
I mean, I've got some. Let me find some notes. I've been trying to write on this recently. It's like this elephant in the room thing. I wanted to write a book about accelerationism that didn't mention land and displaced land completely and talked about these other influences. And I've started writing an entire chapter about his whole history. Just like, oh fuck it, you can't avoid it. But I was trying to write something about Dark Enlightenment the other day because I do find it's one of those things that his version dominates, where there's something sort of more in there. Let me find what I wrote. So I mean, it's this question of like a transcendental materialism thing that if historical materialism, the point is that where reality produces consciousness, not the other way around. And Kant's whole thing is that, I mean, you probably be able to summarize this better than I can, that we can't know the things in themselves. So so we have a transcendental materialism. But I guess the way that Land goes further is that he does that. He materializes critique. So, if I mean, my Kant's not great, but I guess what he sort of says that Kant's whole thing of critique is that it's not just being scathing about things, the sort of the way that we understand a critic today, but like, you know, it's that process of really like systematically working through thought so you can actually get to the most abstract limits. You can kind of find the limits of thought. And Land's position, as I understand it, is that capitalism materializes that. It's not, because Kant's position is a transcendental idealism. Land argues that it's a transcendental materialism where it's actually capitalism that is automated that process of critique beyond ourselves. So it's the market is the function of critique rather than human thinking about freedom or whatever. Now, I guess that the point that if there's that's an argument that I think is you can find in Fang Noumena, right? That's just like, and I mean, that's kind of not a rhetorical question because I feel like you'll be more informed on this than I am, but like you can find that kind of argument in some respect, like going back to like the 90s, I think, in his work. The Dark Enlightenment, as I understand it, is not really any different. The politics has slightly shifted, but there's a really good essay by Elizabeth Rodanesco. She's a Lacanian psychoanalyst, and I think she wrote like a history of psychoanalysis. It's like this massive 2-volume thing. She's really cool. But she's got this essay called Freud, Thinker of the Dark Enlightenment. And the Dark Enlightenment's also a phrase that comes from like the Frankfurt School. It's Adorno and Horkheimer. They talk about how the Dark Enlightenment is this idea, is the kind of eclipsing of that ideal version of reason that actually, like Lacan has it with like his argument of like Kant with Descartes. If you have Kant's categorical imperative, that it's like you act as if the way that you wanted to act was the law for everybody or something like that. I'm butchering my Kant. But then Lacan's argument is that, well, that's such an individualist argument that like what the Marquis de Sade does is he takes the categorical imperative to its extreme. He's just like, I'm a sociopath and I just want to hurt people and I'm going to just write about a world where that's the law for everybody. Like it's like, you know, the Kant cashes out in sadism, which I think Land probably isn't far off doing a similar sort of trajectory. So, you know, and I guess that's it, right? It's that reason doesn't necessarily following the path of reason doesn't necessarily just mean progress, like an exponential graph of progress. Freud said that, the Frankfurt School said that, and Land's Dark Enlightenment for me is just his, as I understand it, it's just him carrying that forwards, but cashing it out in that kind of like the neo-reactionary politics of that era of just, well, it's just as capitalism, as you know, talking about London. I feel like that, I know Land talks about, uses Shanghai as the main example for neo-reactionary like city. I've never been to Shanghai, but I have been to, if you're ever in London and you go to Greenwich Park, where the Greenwich Meridian line is and all that, and then you look down across Greenwich, and what do you sort of see? The Queen's House and the old Palace of Greenwich, and then the Thames, and you cross over and it's Canary Wharf, and you have that, like that line of sight that happens to be the birthplace of time. Technically, you look from that line where time begins, globalized time starts, and what you see is like monarchy and the modern capitalism sort of sitting side by side. It's the neo-reactionary viewpoint in the world, as far as I'm concerned. I feel like that, but that's kind of it, right? That you have this idea of progress, that for Land cashes out in this weird, like atemporal disparity between monarchism and capitalism existing side by side, and that progress from what is basically our mundane existence now, at least in the UK, cashes out in a Moldbugian reality. It doesn't, like, it's not, it's a Moldbug sort of, it's the sort of horror, I think, the realization that what Moldbug talks about sounds so extreme and extravagant, when actually you look from Greenwich and you draw a straight line outwards to the future, and that's just where you end up. Like, it's not as, it's kind of that, it is that strange realization that you were talking about before, where it starts off sounding Lovecraftian and horrible, and actually it's just mundane reality in all of its glory, and that's kind of what's so horrifying about it. But yeah, that's my slightly niche position on the Dark Enlightenment. I wrote a blog post about this a while ago, and a bunch of like the original neo-reactionary bloggers like totally shat on me from a great height. Didn't like it, but I think it's historically accurate.
Which bloggers?
I can't even remember their names now. What, I think I either got blocked or Blade blocked me, but it was I'll find the maybe I'll try and find the well, if you Google it, it was called "Make the Dark Enlightenment Great Again" was the title of the post. On xenogothic.com. If anyone was interested and wants to read through that, I think I talked about the Twitter argument that happened around it in there, but I don't want to go searching now because I'll just end up getting lost in the clickhole. But yeah, I can't remember the names, but it was a nice bit of Twitter drama for at least 2 days.
Yeah. Good old Twitter drama. I miss the days of hell threads and Twitter drama. But there we go. Yeah, man. Is there anything you want to add in about your book that you feel we've sort of missed?
I don't think so. I feel like it's been great. I mean, it's just the a kind of, a lot of this is, it's probably, if anyone hasn't read it now goes and reads it, there might be a slight disparity. But I guess I've been sitting on it for it's about 18 months since it came out, and digesting that process in a small room has been very strange. So I think what I'm expecting now will probably be quite different to what's in the book, at least the sort of progression. So if you want to know the basis for a lot of this thinking, then just, I guess it's in there. But yeah, don't be alarmed if there's some discontinuity between our chat and what I wrote in there. Just the nature of
always, really.
Yeah, isn't it? But it's very strange to actually. It's one thing doing that on a blog where you can just write more blogs and bury it down further and further. It's different when it's a book, and it just seems it's just going to be there forever as like this is what you think and will always think, apparently, and it's very difficult to talk about how your thought develops post a book before you've written a new one.
Yeah, I mean, I really I thought I used to think about this a fair bit. I used to not dislike authors who were like, that's my juvenilia, or that they're like, no, before then. But now I completely understand that, because I I look back at basically everything I've written. I'm like, no, you know.
It's hard. At the same time, I kind of want to say like I'm immensely proud of it, and I do like if you want to read it, like it's pretty good. I think I remember like I remember it was quite. I've never been happier with like putting something out. So I think it's I don't know. It's just the weird psychology of it is weird. You kind of do have to let these things go and do their own thing. But I kind of embrace it as that. I'm happy that it's a document of 2 years, and I think that's it's dated. It's kind of almost not. It's not quite written like a diary, but a lot of the passages are dated to certain times, and it revolves around events sort of as they happened. And I sort of hope that sort of trajectory. I mean, it could essentially. It's a book that could have continued going forever. So there's another chapter to be written, and I'm hopefully writing that now, but in a very different context. It's not Egress.
I was gonna ask, but how long do you think until this book's ready?
I don't know. I thought it would be ready. I had a deadline for September, and it's August, and it's not there. But it's quite fraught. I'm genuinely terrified about writing a book about accelerationism and putting it out publicly because of everything it deals.
Yeah, I guess that would be the first. That would be the first actual like secondary. I mean, the accelerationist reader.
I mean, well, that's the thing. There's loads of like the Benjamin Noyes has at least 2 books on it. Stephen Shapiro's got 2. Mark Fisher and other people. The people wrote lots of essays online. There's been a lot of activity around it for sure. Be sort of out beyond the reader. But I guess it's just that I feel like for me anyway. There's something to be written about what accelerationism was and is sort of post Christchurch when. Like the sort of structure of the book that I kind of can't quite get past at the moment is that, you know, when it was after Mark died. I don't think I mentioned it in the book in Egress, that is. But I remember being sat around in the canteen at Goldsmiths with Kojo Eshin and Steve Goodman. And Kojo had like a little briefcase and he brought out a copy of The Guardian from that day, and it had this Andy Beckett article, which you can still read online. It's the accelerationism, how a fringe idea predicted the world in which we live, or something like that. And Andy Beckett's a great writer. He's got a really great books, histories of the 1970s and stuff. I think maybe he even wrote something for Zero Books back in the day. But it's like a really, it's I mean, it's for The Guardian. It was like their it's like the supplementary paper that they had, like that they do on like a weekend. But it was like the cover it was like the main story in that article was about fucking accelerationism. And so I guess that's for me is like for us at the time, that's like it was the sort of pinnacle of like the public accelerationism entering the public consciousness. It's fucking like a 10,000 word essay in The Guardian about this like fringe philosophy. And then 2 years later, you've got the Vox article about how Nick Land being interviewed in orbit of the Christchurch shooter. And I guess this is kind of, I should say, this is certainly inspired by the course that you and me did. The courses, I suppose, before it was kind of an initial attempt at how to see what happened, to think about what happened between those moments. And it's kind of continued on with that thinking and trying to flesh it out a bit. But I mean, I think that there's something to be said for how that happened, not just for the sake of accelerationism, but I think like someone could do one about postmodernism, but the way that's kind of gone from. I think there's a great book on Perry Anderson writes about like postmodernism was first used as a literary word in like 1940s Latin America as like something, I don't know, in there, and then it gets picked up again sort of later as like this political thing. And then now you have like Jordan Peterson throwing it about as like postmodern neo-Marxism, all this sort of stuff. And that's like almost a century from when the word was coined to its like utter decay into just gibberish. And it's very fitting, I think, that accelerationism, I think, as the history of that as a term, first coined in 2008, and then about a decade later, you can't mention it without having to explain yourself for about an hour. True to form as like an acceleration of that very like process of like information disintegration, like the very meaning of it just completely just disintegrating into its opposite. It's interesting just for that. I think that its very failure is a kind of proof of concept. It shows how fast now that process happens. And I think that's the reason why there's maybe one last thing to be said about it before we just maybe bury it for good, because it's hard. You can't use it anymore.
Yeah. It needs to die. It needs to die a death.
Yeah.
You know, it's so weird. Like thinking back, like that whole sphere. You know, it's like 2017, but really got going, and you know that's 4 years, and the word it's just been dragged through the dirt, and I don't know. I feel like there's this whole group of people, me and you included, where it's like you mention it, and it's like flashbacks to these just hellish threads and discussions and blogging on like everyone there from all their respective sides being like, how the hell are we gonna we already know we can't deal with this thing,
Yeah.
which is why I gave up, moved on.
Yeah, but it's crazy. That's the thing. It's the one thing that when there was a review of the Post-Capitalist Desire book, and I think Mark like affirms that the accelerationist thinking of, like, I think since the past 10 years, is the biggest influence for him for writing his Acid Communism book and doing this course. And he says like, it's the most influential thing on my thinking. And I remember reading a review of it, I think it was on Goodreads, and someone was like, "This is a great book, but I just can't understand Fisher's really weird version of accelerationism." Like, I didn't think it would be. It's become so controversial. Like, I remember it always happens on Twitter where, like, I talk about. I remember. I think it happened when we were doing our discussion, and someone like some reply guy was like, "I don't think you can call Mark Fisher an accelerationist." And then I just quoted like the line from his like Terminator vs. Avatar book in the Reader that's just like, "Mark Fisher, everyone is an accelerationist." I don't know if you remember that, but that was partly. I think it's partly something that we had to deal with that course. But it's it's. I mean, yeah, I feel like everyone has just given up. But it's the thing is that like it's I don't know. I feel like it's partly just because of this complete disconnection between the philosophy that was going on at that time and the politics. Like it's just everyone just thinks of land's politics. But you look at go back to the original blogosphere, and everyone's sort of talking about how we can use these philosophies of immanence for any political ends, never mind just what land has in mind. Like it's a really open question. And it's kind of like it feels like I don't know. I mean, I don't want to hypothesize about why it happened, but it feels kind of in line with a lot of what Mark Fisher talks about. Like he talks about like a reflexive impotence, or sort of around the crash too. I guess I don't know. It's just any thinking of how we might possibly get out of this like just stagnation is so mistrusted. And go the way of accelerationism and be transformed in that horribly to be the complete opposite, I think, of what it was ever meant to be. Like that's the thing too, right? About that Vox article, I think that people were saying like when the Christchurch shooter was being dismissed, it's like he is the subject that accelerationism first set out to critique. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was kind of just like seen as like that's just a thing that you're going to say, but it's like it's like when people dismiss land as like being an extreme neoliberal or something. Like if we're going to define neoliberalism, it can surely be like the renewal, the literal renewal of like liberalism's focus on the individual, and how the individual should be freed to intervene and make the most of like a free market. Like you can intervene in the process and you can make something of yourself. And like Land's whole philosophy is the opposite of that. The individual has no agency, cannot intervene in the system at all. It's so pessimistic to the point that that's kind of why that Tarrant thinks the Christchurch shooter thinks he can have any significant input into the system at all. Is how he's that's just the first step of a betrayal of what accelerations was talking about. Never mind all the violence and all the rest of his just bullshit. But that it's that fundamental, and that we never, and then but that's just not even part of the conversation of like, so I think it's a valid part of the conversation, not to try and salvage accelerationism, but actually talk about how people are experiencing capitalism right now. Like the fact that you do feel like you have no agency, or the idea that any agency that you do have has to be sort of put into some weird extremist project is just like it is precisely the kind of situation that accelerationism was meant to intervene in. But we're on another planet now, it turns out.
We'll soon be on Mars, so it's all good. Capitalism will soon be on Mars, and we can watch it grow again.
It can stay there. We'll do someone else. I mean, I will. I'll try and do something. Just in Huddersfield.
I think that'll be what happens if they ever did actually get there. I think they'd just all leave, and they'd just leave Earth to become whatever it becomes. Yeah. I think it's a good place to finish up, man.
This has been a bit of a marathon one.
Yeah. So I think we're almost going on 2 hours. So I'll finish up. Thanks everyone for listening. Matt, thanks for coming on.